Alright, today I'm going to be talking to you and instructing you on the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was the longest war, as well as the most unpopular war in American history. The United States spent over $2 billion on this war. France controlled Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which was called the French Indochina. The Vietnamese waged war against France. France was forced to leave Vietnam, and the nationalist forces defeated the troops at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. During World War II, Japan controlled the area. Ho Chi Minh was a communist supporter who formed Vietnam and overthrew the Japanese forces that took control during World War II. The U.S. enemies with Japan and sent military aid to Vietnam. The French troops decided to drive out the Viet Minh and asked the U.S. for help. Ho Chi Minh was trying to spread communism, and anti-colonial was waged against France. The U.S. decided to provide military assistance to France. Vietnam was divided into half at the 17th parallel. The north was led by Ho Chi Minh, the south by Ngo Dinh Diem. In 1956, there were elections that was held, and Diem refused to allow elections as Ho Chi Minh was sure to win. This led to a civil war in Vietnam that the U.S. was caught in the middle of. The U.S. wanted to stop communism. Ho Chi Minh formed a new army called the Viet Cong. So the U.S. sent military advisors to train South Vietnam. President Johnson escalated the war by claiming to have had 2 U.S. destroyers fired upon, which was unprovoked by the North Vietnamese boats. However, President Johnson failed to mention that the U.S. ships were also spying on the Viet Cong. The Gulf of Tonkin was the location where the American ships were attacked at. The use of guerrilla warfare played a major role in Vietnam. The U.S. thought this would be an easy victory, however, it wasn't. They were caught off guard by the Viet Cong by ambushes, tripwires, landmines, booby traps, and sneak attacks. Both the communists and the non-communists that opposed the South Vietnam government were members of the National Liberation Front, also known as the NLF, recruited members from Saigon and had some success in fighting with the South Vietnamese government. In 1965, the NLF attacked 2 U.S. Army installations that was set up in South Vietnam. President Johnson ordered bombing missions in North Vietnam. The missions were known as Operation Rolling Thunder, which used phosphorus and napalm bombs. And then there was Operation Ranch Hand, which was the use of Agent Orange. Here's a photograph of tunnels that were used by the Viet Cong near Saigon, as they would hide in these tunnels from the bombings, and then they would ambush any Americans or any of the allies that would come in from the U.S. to try to seek them out. The U.S. used search and destroy tactics in areas where the Viet Cong were taught to be. Troops would go in and search for weapons, and if any were found, they gathered up the villagers and would burn down the villages. The Tet Offensive was the largest military campaign in Vietnam. This was attacks of the southern cities by the NLF. It consisted of the Viet Cong and Vietnam against South Vietnam. U.S., and their allies. The My Lai massacre was a cover-up by the United States. It was brought to light by a journalist, where over 400 civilians, which included men, women, and children, were killed by U.S. troops. This led to a serious blow of the credibility of the United States. In 1968, President Nixon said he had a secret plan to end the war. It involved Vietnamization, which was a strategy to bring American troops home and increase air war over North Vietnam, and rely on South Vietnam for ground attacks. During Nixon's presidency, the war even expanded into Laos and Cambodia, which violated the international rights of these countries. In 1972, President Nixon used bombing raids to target the largest cities in North Vietnam, which were Hanoi and Haiphong. The attacks were known as the Christmas bombings. In 1973, the White House convinced Saigon that if they would sign a peace treaty, they would abandon the South Vietnam armies. On January 23rd, the final draft was initiated, ending hostilities between the United States and North Vietnam. This was the end of the war for the United States. However, Saigon continued to battle communist forces, and South Vietnam was taken over by North Vietnam.